Welcome back. This is Module 5, and it's a discussion on the content of Discover Canada through a discourse analysis. So let's get started. We know that the guide's replacement is imminent. However, by understanding the nuanced, hidden, and normalized language of settler colonialism, we can recognize it in other publications. The problems I'm going to show discursively in this module are not the only problems in the guide. I have chosen two areas of focus to provide examples so you can make connections to other sections as you go through the guide, as you're realizing how we're teaching it as well when you look at the colonial pedagogy module, which is the module after this one. So during my study of debates in the literature in the guide, I found a discursive analysis prepared by education scholar Ikumi Yoshida. And Yoshida argues that the guide is a hegemonic settler-making tool, articulating a distinct power narrative through exploitive discourses to silence and deny settler colonial structural violence. And I will actually extend beyond Yoshida that the guide is a hegemonic settler-making tool to convert newcomers into second-class settlers whose diversity is to validate Canada's multiculturalism. Because in Canada, white European settlers are not part of the diverse multicultural population, nor are the Indigenous others. So the political dimensions of the multicultural population is actually, in my view, to prop up Canada's narrative as a beacon of human rights and peacemaking. The guide implicitly and explicitly imparts these myths. As a reminder, settler colonialism is an invasive settler society with a distinctive identity and sovereignty to replace Indigenous populations. It also establishes systems of relations through three different agencies: the settler, which is the colonizer, the Indigenous other, which is the colonized people, and the immigrant other, who are subaltern exogenous others. So the subaltern represents the subordinate social groups that are repressed, they are neglected, and at best, I should say, on the margins of the hegemonic histories, discourse, and social formations. As part of its sovereign assertion against interference in Indigenous existence, the Indigenous other and exogenous immigrant other progressively disappear under the settler body politic, and it's through the extreme, the extremeness of genocide or cultural genocide and assimilation. It is perhaps Said's concepts, affiliated structures in the text, um, that can illuminate further the normative culture in the intertextuality of materials that form Western sensibilities. Understanding the text more democratically requires us to look beyond the Eurocentric epistemological framework. So we're going to look at the affiliated structures in the text. In doing so, we use wordliness to find a way to engage the text between its meanings and the text being in the world in that context. So, for example, in the guide, the British monarchy has a prominent role in Canada's national narrative, exercising its power over Canada as part of the British colonial empire pre and post Act of Settlement in 1701. Pictures of the current queen and discussions of the monarchy as the oldest constitutional monarchy in North America, for example, act as a celebration in our normalized condition. Those would be the affiliated structures in the text. They're obviously written. The affiliated structures, the missing narratives, are the wealth and power accumulated by the monarchy through colonization, Indigenous genocide, and slave trafficking of African peoples. So, Indigenous erasure is the silencing of Indigenous culture, the ways of being, and the history, Indigenous history, and official narratives. As the guide is a government publication, its context and meaning indicate who is included and excluded from the national narrative. So the first mention of Aboriginal people in the guide is on page 8, under Rights and Responsibilities of Citizenship. Its 23 words accounts for 7% of the page's content. The Magna Carta of 1215, habeas corpus, The Constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, language rights, and multiculturalism dominate the narrative with no explanation on Aboriginal rights other than that the Charter will not interfere with them. So, what are Aboriginal people's rights? Doesn't say. Aboriginal people are mentioned next under page 10, under who we are, as founding peoples of Canada with the British and French. To understand what it means to be Canadian, it is important to know about our three founding peoples: Aboriginal, French, and British. Well, this is emphatically false. Confederation in 1867 was mostly an English affair with concessions given to French peoples. Indigenous peoples did not participate, they had no voice. They were instead subjected to enfranchisement, for example, to gain citizenship. So, enfranchisement meant deleting one's Indigenous identity and culture, language, and spirituality for the complete adoption to Western ontological ways. So, if you look at the numbered treaties, the Indian Act of 1876, and the residential school system, clearly this denies Indigenous membership in the founding of Canada. Instead of learning about Aboriginal peoples, learners read content that places Canada's history as starting with European establishment on quote unquote Turtle Island, erasing Indigenous presence. If you're not familiar with the term Turtle Island, it could mean the world. It's an Indigenous term. It could mean the world. It could mean North America. It depends which community, Indigenous community. So continuing, the paragraph that leads who we are frames this narrative. So Canada is known around the world as a strong and free country. Canadians are proud of their unique identity. We have inherited the oldest continuous constitutional tradition in the world. We are the only constitutional monarchy in North America. Our institutions uphold a commitment to peace, order, and good government, a key phrase in Canada's original constitutional document in 1867. The British North America Act, a belief in order, liberty, enterprise, hard work, and fair play has enabled Canadians to build a prosperous society in a rugged environment from our Atlantic shores to the Pacific Ocean and to the Arctic Circle. So much so that poets and songwriters have hailed Canada as the Great Dominion. There's no mention of Indigenous presence in that little blurb of history of Canada. Indigenous presence is brought in through another context, which I'll explain in a few minutes. So, references to Indigenous peoples contain really only technical information of Indigenous beliefs and treaties, along with paternalistic language on residential schools and overall being. Um, I think when I read in today's Canada, Aboriginal peoples enjoy renewed pride and confidence and have made significant achievements in agriculture, the environment, business, and the arts. That is so um, rude and ignorant when the truth of how Aboriginal peoples were um, treated, forced to live on reservations and controlled and contained there, along with the residential schools. Like it's kind of behooves people outside of the Aboriginal community to comment on their pride and confidence. Anyways, in particular, readers are made to understand that English speaking settlers, as heirs to 8 centuries of British tradition and European Christian civilization, are the original people. Continuing with who we are on page 10 of the guide, this section leads with commentary, as I said, of Canada as a strong and free country that inherited the oldest continuous constitutional traditions in the world and has the only constitutional monarchy in North America. I'm sorry to remind you about that, but it links to what I'm going to say next. So the commentary entrenches the beliefs of peace, order, and good government through a colonial pedagogy, which we call the hidden curriculum. And we'll be speaking more about that in Module 6. But this is the implicit instruction of beliefs and values in text. that teach learners. So the above opening narrative further establishes the European way of life as a civilization of modernity and peacefulness, so that when the learner begins to read about Aboriginal peoples underneath, they demarcate Europe as modern civilization with no attribution to the Aboriginal way of life, that in the colonial narrative is in need of civilization or civilizing. So the hidden curriculum and affiliated structures in the text continue in the opening sentence of the first paragraph under Aboriginal peoples, implicating Indigenous peoples as settlers. So the sentence reads, the ancestors of Aboriginal peoples are believed to have migrated from Asia many thousands of years ago. The pictures of Indigenous peoples on page 10 remain unnamed except for the fetishized image showing Haida artist Bill Reid carving a totem pole, a false Canadian notion of indigeneity, that a totem pole is emblematic of all Indigenous peoples. It's actually connected to the Haida culture. And I strongly encourage you actually to Google Bill Reid and his art, jewelry, and other sculptures. He's world renowned and world acclaimed actually for his artistry. So on page 11, under the title Unity in Diversity, we see a picture of Canada's 15th Governor General, John Buchan, wearing a Kainai First Nation headdress. This is cultural misappropriation because that headdress represents something that's earned and very honorable. It's not to be given lightly. So Buchan wearing this headdress whitewashes Canada's policies on immigration and contributions to the national character. It was exposed um, in Buchan's writings, which they reference actually him as a novelist, um, his anti Semitism and beliefs that Black Africans called out for white domination by Great Britain to rule over them. And that should not be surprising because he also ran concentration camps in South Africa during the Boer War that segregated the Indigenous Blacks from white settlers. The guide's consistent emphasis on European traditions includes the founding document of Canada, the British North America Act of 1867, which has more hidden curriculum and affiliated structures in the text. Further erasure of Indigenous life takes place in descriptions that establish settlers in an uninhabited, rugged environment. A belief in ordered liberty, enterprise, hard work, and fair play has enabled Canadians to build a prosperous society in a rugged environment from our Atlantic shores to the Pacific Ocean and to the Arctic Circle, so much so that poets and songwriters have hailed Canada as the Great Dominion. So the message is, the meritocracy, right? If you work hard, you will succeed and live a prosperous life. The missing part of the text is the Indigenous genocide and dispossession that made the land available for taking and turning into a prosperous enterprise. To have this validated by poets and songwriters, Canada earns the title of a great dominion. Sort of makes me question, it's a great dominion from the beauty of the land or the wealth it made Great Britain and the settlers who benefited. So the consistent theme of Terra Nullius focuses the pioneering narrative of settlers negotiating their survival in a harsh, empty, unoccupied wilderness. It also affirms the settler colonial narrative of legally taking the lands as they were empty. Veracini, an expert on settler colonialism, refers to this form of Indigenous erasure as perception transfer, and it's explained as Indigenous peoples are disavowed in a variety of ways, and their actual presence is not registered, especially with the image of an empty landscape. So when Indigenous people eventually enter the field of settler perception, Indigenous presence deemed in settler space is therefore exogenous and threatening. Yoshida further emphasized the guide's discursive treatment of the occupation of the lands by settlers through images of empty lands and narratives of emptiness. So, again, the terra nullius theme. It is this discursive process that indigenizes the settlers to the land, whose descendants linguistically are native to Canada, such as the first line of the Canadian anthem, O Canada, our home and native land. Other language labels in the guide reference Canada as a land of immigrants, not a nation or country. It moves the settler colonial discourse away from its history and positions settlers as immigrants, not colonizers. There is no mention of Indigenous peoples in this narrative. Therefore, the use of language in the guide is instrumental in indigenizing settler vocabulary. The vocabulary, pronouns, and verbs indigenizing settlers de-indigenize Indigenous peoples, in contrast with other groups. The use of pronouns in narratives of nation building and national history are essential to who is included and excluded. The storyteller in the guide is we, who tell stories of us and them as part of the pioneer narrative. Positions of hierarchy communicate order to prospective citizens and what is expected of them in their path to citizenship, such as the ultimate expectation to reach the status of Canadian nation. Welcome, it took courage to move to a new country. Your decision to apply for citizenship is another big step. You are becoming part of a great tradition that was built by generations of pioneers before you. Once you have met all the legal requirements, we hope to welcome you as a new citizen with the rights and responsibility of citizenship. And then Canadians take pride in their identity and have made sacrifices to defend their ways of life. By coming to Canada and taking this important step towards Canadian citizenship, you are helping to write the continuing story of Canada. The top of the hierarchical order is we, the Euro heritage Canadians, born in Canada over the others. Who are they? We is the storyteller for all population groups, including the settlers. We is therefore the objective voice who speaks for the Canadian state. Consequently, we has the power to directly talk to you, prospective citizens. Therefore, establishing the notion of the Canadian state communicating directly with prospective citizens. Discursive referencing of pronouns of Indigenous peoples in the guide under Canada's history as they further alienates Indigenous existence through false narratives and silencing of how they died, for example, through forced disease exposure. Warfare was common among Aboriginal groups as they competed for land, resources, and prestige. The arrival of European traders, missionaries, soldiers, and the colonists changed the native way of life forever. Large numbers of Aboriginals died of European diseases to which they lacked immunity. We know that um, some that there was a concerted effort to make Indigenous people ill and die. It wasn't by happen chance. Another example of discursive alienation through vocabulary in the passive and is in the passive. An active voice widens the distinction between groups. So most Canadians of Asian descent had, in the past, been denied the vote in federal and provincial elections. In 1948, the last of these, the Japanese Canadians, gained the right to vote. Aboriginal people were granted the vote in 1960. Today, every citizen over the age of 18 may vote. Okay, so when we look at the vocabulary, for example, commentary of Japanese Canadians with the context of the last of these to access voting rights, with no context describing Indigenous peoples' voting rights conveys less importance, with an implication that they are lower in the hierarchy of the others. I'm referring to the Indigenous peoples. The use of the verbs. So let's see here. The use of the active and passive voices depict Japanese Canadians as actively working to gain the right to vote and the Indigenous peoples as passively waiting for the same rights. So by placing Japanese Canadians and Indigenous peoples in contrast to one another in the same paragraph, the guide reasserts the discourse of Asian origin for First Nations peoples arriving to North America through the Bering Strait theory, which I'll remind you with this um, that line that we looked at a few slides previous. The ancestors of Aboriginal peoples are believed to have migrated from Asia many thousands of years ago. So Indigenous peoples become part of the category of Canadians of Asian descent by being in the same paragraph in conjunction with Japanese Canadians. Okay, so um, I first would like you to reflect on the positioning of the title, The Equality of Women and Men, its explanation and accompanying pictures. So if you look over here on the left, you see this section up here. It's under the previous page, the section Rights and Responsibility of Citizenship. So it's really like a call out, it's acting as a call out. And maybe reflect why they're doing that. So I'm going to give you my perspective. There are design tricks here, and it is for this information to stand out in the guide's presentation. Okay, so the rest of the section is designed as a report, but this small section stands alone. And what are we seeing? We see a center picture depicting a girl and a woman wearing hijabs. The adjacent pictures present women on a smaller scale and further away from the camera lens, so they're not as in focus. So it seems there is a connection of the images to Islam, like the narrative is to draw us into the idea of Islam. So the content of the message does not directly implicate Muslim people. It doesn't say Islam or Muslim, but the picture and the text working together leave you with the understanding that this is about Muslim peoples. So in Canada, men and women are equal under the law. I'm reading this short paragraph. Canada's openness and generosity do not extend to barbaric cultural practices that tolerate spousal abuse, honor killings, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, or other gender based violence. Those guilty of these crimes are severely punished under Canada's criminal laws. Before I actually continue, I just want to say but in Canada, this is not true. Okay, the issue of spousal abuse is it's very difficult to get any resolution on this. I mean, there in my community over Christmas past, a woman was killed by her husband, and her family um, made public statements that they feel failed by the justice system and the police who did not help to protect her. So it's disingenuous to make statements like this and to lead learners into believing that if they are experiencing spousal abuse, for example, that there is, a system that will protect them. All right. So getting back to the discursive analysis. So the passage orientalizes Muslims as uncivilized and culturally barbaric. As a critical concept developed by Edward Said, Orientalism is a body of theory and practice that examines how the West constructs people and their culture of the East in materials and knowledge systems, which are designed and written for consumption by those in the West. Okay, so Said argues that Orientalism in Western scholarship focuses on the Eastern world and is rooted in imperialist societies who produce it, in particular 19th and 20th century French and British intellectuals who published their travels, art, and literature. Excuse me. Consequently, their biased perspective of Eastern languages, arts, cultures, sciences, religions, and beliefs has a lasting impact. They exoticize Eastern beauty and reduce Eastern cultures as primitive, labeling them backwards and barbaric, so therefore in need, desperate need of civilization. The title, The Equality of Men and Women, is performative and covers up long-standing inequalities of employment, economics, and education that tell a different story of women in Canada. Furthermore, it weaponizes women's rights as a clash of civilizations against women, not of European culture. By creating this discourse on the defense of women's rights, the state's concerns are not women's autonomy or feminist politics, but are acting as an alignment with imperial interests. And Jaffrey quotes Tickton in their document, and I think this is a very important quote. And it says particularly, debates and policies on sexual violence function according to logics of cultural otherness, condemning violence primarily when it is attached to readily recognized tropes of alterity, such as forced marriage, honor killings, or excision. So the statements also take a selective position against barbaric cultural practices by externalizing gender violence as an imported phenomenon. As a rhetorical device, barbaric cultural practices and Canada's openness and generosity positions Muslim women as needing Canada's Western civilization and protection. The rhetoric also implicates Muslim men as dangerous, as opposed to the civilized European men who created Canada and embody the voice of the guide. So I'd like to actually present you a recording of my colleague who I'll be introducing in the recording. And I'd like you to reflect as you're listening, and we're not going to listen to the full recording, we'll listen to the first 6-7 minutes. But I'd like you to reflect on what Muhammad is speaking about and how that impacts learners in the classroom and our positionality as teachers to expose them to the rhetoric of the guide, such as this section on gender violence.
Hello, everyone. I'm so grateful for my colleague, Muhammad Ali. Hello, Muhammad.
Hello, Sean. How are you?
Great. I'm so glad that you came to help us really understand more how distressing this passage can be for learners in the language classroom. I'd like to just do a little introduction about you, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, so Muhammad is my colleague. He's a PhD student at Queen's University and an expert on actually FGM. And I would like to show this article that was recently published by Muhammad titled The Patriarchy and the Biopolitics of FGM. I think it's a must read. I think everybody should actually read this article. I did go through it. It's quite sort of shocking, but also really provides a lot of context and understanding. And this was for sure a labor of love, I believe, Muhammad. Congratulations for really exposing how this comes together.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll keep the good fight up.
It's an important fight, and it's important that people outside of the community have a strong understanding to support you as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a passage, as you know, in the Citizenship Guide, and we've talked a little bit before about it. And I would just like to give you the floor, and maybe you can speak to us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sean. Yeah, and I think I'll just get to it. So we had this discussion before, and of course, when you read this out to me, I was like, you know, why would they write something like that? And I'll just go through it. So the equality of women. So this is showing the rights of the men and women with respect to Canada. So it says, in Canada, men and women are equal under the law. Canada's openness and generosity do not extend to barbaric cultural practices that tolerate spousal abuse, honor killings, female genital mutilation, forced marriages, and other gender-based violence. Those guilty of these crimes are severely punished under Canada's criminal laws. So this is Canada's law. This is something that was set forth, and it's a right of every man and woman under this country, Canada, to enjoy those rights, okay? However, it has to be sensitively, how do we say, custom made, or rather, because this is something that it is part of it's a module for newcomers and for refugees and English learners who are new to this country. First of all, we have to remember that these people have fled their countries, and nobody wants to leave their country for another. I can tell you this, I came here to study, but it was very difficult for me, knowing that I still have a country to go back to, knowing that I still have people to go back to. But being in this country was difficult enough, you know, trying to adjust, I already know the language, you know, I'm someone who can easily move around, but still it was very difficult for me. I had to go through, you know, a phase of, I wouldn't call it depression, but a similar kind of a thing. It was very difficult. And thanks to a few friends, you know, like Sean, who were able to hold my hand and take me through this. And thank you, Sean, for this. So when you're teaching something like this to people, remember these people have, if I found it offensive and I'm not even fleeing from my country, I'm a clear advocate against such, you know, things such as FGM, and you know, I'm a big advocate, and I wouldn't want things like this done to my own people. But remember, these are refugees. These are people already who are traumatized, but they have run away from a specific event. It could be war, it could be forced marriage, it could be FGM, it could be all that. But still, remember, these people come from a culture that they still uphold so high, okay? Their culture comes first, they have a religion, they have a way of life, okay? So terming what they have known as their culture as barbaric is already what puts these people already feel that, okay, I'm not so welcome here. If I'm fleeing from this culture, if I'm free, I'm trying to free myself from what happened to me. For example, I'm running away from FGM. Yes, it's a bad practice. Yes, we are fighting it every day. But this is something that was done to my people. It was done to my mother. It was done to her mother. It was done to my relatives. It was done to the people in my life. It could be done to my sister. It could have been done to anybody that is around me. So it's a way of life. It's bad, it's wrong, it's harmful, okay? But you can't call a whole culture that has this as a way of life as barbaric. So already you're telling this person barbaric. So what even the word barbar means, barbaric, it goes back, I think, to the Greek, if I'm not wrong. And anything else that was not their own, they used to like say it's blah 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 blah, like this is just gibberish, that you know, it's just something that doesn't make sense. So, and I think the definition of the word barbaric here means primitive, something that is, you know, way backward. And already this person, you're a newcomer, you've already been classified as someone from a backward culture. That already puts you under like you're already feeling intimidated. You're with these people already that you used to see on TV, and you're with them now, and already, because of the obvious color of your skin and how you look different from them, there is also another attachment to who you are already. And that means you come from this barbaric background. You come from this barbaric culture, okay? The whole culture itself doesn't mean that it's barbaric. We have 99% of very beautiful things that we uphold, that we love, that we know, call our people, some things that we look forward to, some things that we miss, our food, our traditions, our cultures, our people, our music, our dances, our stories, our history. There's a lot that we miss. So a harmful practice like FGM, it needs to be singled out. That yes, it is, but it doesn't necessarily mean it cannot be cultural. It could be medical. It could be religious to some people, though it's not in the Islamic religion. It's not even it's not a thing in Islam. Actually, it's only supposed to be done for men, and it's even medical for men for health reasons. But it's not even advocated for by Islam. And of course, I will tell you, 90% of the people who do this are from the Islamic background. So already portraying a whole culture that is so beautiful as barbaric because of singling out things such as spousal abuse, honor killings. That's just so wrong. The second thing, spousal abuse is not something that you can single out to these people. You cannot tell them barbaric cultural practices such as already you're putting this person in a position, you know what, you're the one who is bringing these evil and backward things to our culture, to our people. Spousal abuse is something that is even right here in Canada. It is something that across the world, the Western countries, the so-called first world countries, the developed world, all of it, spousal abuse is a thing. It's not something that is specific to these people. So is the Western culture barbaric? Is the Western culture primitive? Is the Western culture something that you don't want these people to learn? So if you want to consider the Western culture as barbaric as well, and you tell them, you know what, you're also here, but we have this. So the thing is, it should be the phrasing of this. Yes, these are things that nobody wants. Nobody wants to abuse their spouses. Nobody wants a spouse that is abusive. I mean, it is something that none of us will want to be in. Nobody wants to go through FGM. Nobody wants to go through, the honor killings. And I don't know exactly what honor killings means here because it's already.
I don't feel good ending it at that point, to be frank. I'd like to continue the entire 22 minutes, which I have actually posted on the YouTube channel as well. But I wanted to end it there because he raised some really important questions that really support our reflection and our positionality as teachers. Um, bringing that kind of narrative into the classroom. How does that impact our learners? It's very harmful. It's very distressing. I mean, learners are there to learn English, not be moralized, not be othered. And but he also flipped the coin and said, yes, you also have spousal abuse in Canada. It's universal. It's around the world. Is that are Canadian, essentially white European Canadians, are they barbaric? So these are things to be thinking about, like how our representation. I mean, I am a white woman. I am of British heritage. How is my representation in the classroom without even going there in this passage, without even presenting something like that? So it's something that we need to be thinking about. Okay, so please have a look at the activity section and to see some great reflection prompts. And also I put the link in there for the YouTube recording. And I just will end by showing you these are references I used in this module. I hope to see you in module 6 when we talk about colonial pedagogy, which really reinforces how all this, this type of content is taught. Thank you so much.